11 o'clock. Today is Monday, April 8th, and this is time for our scheduled lesson in classical grammar for the spring term of 2024. So I'm going to get started. These are going to be small groups because they're only accessible to premium students and they're voluntary. All of the meetings will be recorded and the videos will be available, so students are under no obligation to attend these live classes. I'm simply offering the opportunity to attend the live class for students who prefer it and who would like to join me when I go over these lessons and who'd also like to make use of the opportunity to receive some help, especially after I'm finished walking through the lesson. We can take some time. Students can ask any questions they have about the current lesson that I've just talked about in a lesson, or they can ask a question about that subject for another lesson. So live classes just give students an opportunity to walk through a lesson with me while I go through it and ask some questions, get some help if they need it. But really the motivation for me in offering live classes is just to keep myself on a disciplined schedule for the sake of lesson production for courses that students often request help with. So there are some courses that I'm not going to make videos for because I just don't think it's necessary and students don't ask for help. For example, World Chronology, the entire course is text and no one ever asks for any help with World Chronology. But courses like Classical Grammar, Latin and Greek Studies, some of the philosophy courses, things like that, or courses where I just have a desire to make sure that students have some explanation for courses that may be controversial today. I'd like to be able to walk through those things for my own conscience's sake as a teacher and make sure that things are clear or that controversial points are pointed out for the students. But one of the most requested courses for lesson videos and explanations is classical grammar. So I'm going to give a lot of attention to grammar studies. It's also important because grammar is one of the 7 liberal arts, so it's one of our main core courses. So what I'd like to do today is give a quick introduction to the art of grammar, to explain why the study of grammar is important, why we give so much attention to grammar in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and then get into this specific lesson in classical grammar. I've already taught on the first lesson, which has to do with the English letters, and I don't think there's any confusion there. So I'm going to pick up in today's lesson with lesson 2 on the parts of speech and get into that a little bit. But first, as I said, I want to give some general introduction to the study of the art of grammar. Now, one of the difficult things in modern education for students is that modern schools keep all of the old words, but they change their meaning. And this is true of subjects like grammar or the liberal arts. You can go to a modern college and hear about the liberal arts, but what they're talking about is really something very different than what the liberal arts were throughout history. The terms, the words are still used. They're kept in modern education, but the meanings have changed. And this is one of the causes of real confusion for parents and students, even teachers, is that we imagine that because we use the same words that we're doing the same thing, or because we're learning the same words that we're learning the same thing as people did in the past, but that's not true. The words' meanings have changed. Now, in modern schooling, the liberal arts, for example, simply refer to studies that are outside of math and science. So you could take a fine arts class, for example, like a drawing class or a dance class or a music class, and some people might call that liberal arts education. Or if you go to college and study history, that will be in the liberal arts department. But that has nothing to do with liberal arts in history. In history, the liberal arts, first of all, they're arts. Arts are some skills that we learn, that we can learn because they have some rules, things that we can study and then practice, And we can become skilled in an art by simply studying it and practicing it. So there are some things that we can't become skilled at. For example, if you're 5'2", you cannot acquire the skill of dunking a basketball. You may not be able to acquire the skill of singing like a professional opera singer, because much of that is natural talent and natural giftedness. Anything that relates to talent or art or just good luck or opportunity is not an art. An art is something that can be studied and practiced and mastered by anyone who does the work. That's what an art is. So what's important about arts, not every skill is an art. Some skills are gifts. But what's important about arts is that they're human. Arts are human in the sense that any human can do them. And when I say any human, I mean any human with normal faculties. So a person who's handicapped or mentally or physically, they may not be able to perform one of these arts, but a human being with normal faculties who's considered perfect with respect to his faculties just means complete. Usually when we talk about arts, we're talking about things that any human being can do if they study the principles of the art and practice them. That's what makes it an art. So not every skill is an art. You'll notice there are some people who can do things that you cannot do, no matter how hard you try. It's not an art. It has more to do with talent. There are some people who have opportunities to do things that you can't do. That's not an art. That has to do with opportunity. Arts are things that are in every human being's power, and it's just a matter of study and practice. So when we look at learning or the pursuit of wisdom, we find that there are people who are gifted intellectually. There are people who are gifted with respect to studying or memorizing or understanding things, or they're gifted in eloquence and speech. We can't necessarily do everything to the same degree or level of perfection that they might be able to do it. But what happens is when we combine talent and effort, talent and labor, we sometimes find that people who are less talented can outperform people who are more talented because of the effort that they make to study and practice an art. The perfect situation, though, is where a talented person works hard. When a talented person works hard, that's where we find a situation like Thomas Aquinas, where we've got an extraordinarily gifted individual who also works harder than everyone else. And that usually produces, an extraordinary, famous artist. We could think of other people like Mozart in music, right? We have this great talent, but that talent is joined with a tireless, self-sacrificing work ethic that masters the arts as well. That's the ideal situation. So there's 4 different situations: a talented person who works to the best of his ability, a person who's less talented but who works to overperform, a person who's talented but doesn't work and underperforms, and then the worst case would be a person who's neither talented nor diligent in pursuing the arts. So there's 4 different classes, and sometimes the untalented but diligent can outperform the talented but slothful. So when we study these arts, we want to work to exhaust all of our effort to master these arts and really not worry too much about whether we're talented or not, because like I said, if we work diligently and intelligently, we can outperform the more talented. And if we're less talented, we're never going to be able to outperform someone who is more talented and works just as hard or even harder than we do. So we just mind our own business. We don't worry about our talents or other people's talents. We just work to study and master the arts. Now, as I said, when it comes to the pursuit of wisdom, ancient wise men learned that there are 7 key arts that need to be mastered for the sake of the pursuit of wisdom. And these are called the seven liberal arts or the classical liberal arts. And if you go through history, it's pretty cool because you can find paintings and statues and things that depict these seven arts. It's basically our curriculum map in a painting. There are many different ones. You'll see them occasionally on the Academy website and things like that. But there were seven arts identified as the arts of philosophy or the arts of wisdom seeking, and they're called the seven liberal arts. The word liberal, again, is another example of a word that's used in modern culture, but in a different way with a different meaning. Today, if I say I'm a liberal, what it means in modern context is that, I'm a political liberal or I'm an economic liberal. And so some people, especially Christians who tend to be what's called conservative, they get confused by that word. Why would we call the academy the classical liberal arts academy? They get all nervous about that. But that's got nothing to do with the meaning of the word liberal when we talk about the liberal arts. Remember, in the ancient world, there were always two main classes of people. There were free men and there were slaves. And in modern society, we tend to have an idea of slavery that's very political and confusing. We often think of worst case scenarios. We think of masters abusing slaves, and then we characterize slavery as this system where one group of people captures and oppresses and exploits another group of people. And that's really not fair because throughout history, slavery was much more complicated than that. There were all different kinds of slaves or servants, and it wasn't necessarily something that was done against another person's will. For example, in early America, you can think about the situation where a new world is discovered, and there's a giant ocean between Europe and this new world. And there are many, many people who would like to travel to America, but they can't afford to sail across the ocean. So one of the ways that many of the first people came to America was through a system that was called indentured servanthood. Indentured servanthood was a way of paying for something. So if you didn't have enough money to travel from Europe to America, you could make an agreement with a person who owned a ship or a person who was already in America who owned a farm. You could make an agreement where they would pay for your travel expenses to get you across the ocean, and then you would pay them back by serving them for a certain amount of time. You would basically live with them and work for them for no pay in order to repay the debt that you had. And it was a voluntary form of servanthood. So you would come across the ocean, put in your time, work for maybe a couple years, pay off your debt, and then you'd be free. So slavery and servanthood was much more complicated. But there were always these two classes of people. There were the free men and there were slaves in some form of slavery. Now, free men were often born free. It often had to do with wealth. It had to do with the family that you were born into and so on, whether you were born into a royal family or a wealthy noble family. To be a free man often meant that you had wealth, but it didn't necessarily mean that you were wealthy. What it meant was that you had freedom. And because you had freedom, you were responsible to use that freedom well. And so there were studies that were considered appropriate for free men. A good comparison in more modern times would be like if you think about the Victorian age in England, how they spoke about certain men being gentlemen, right? If you've ever seen or read Pride and Prejudice, you know what it means to be a gentleman in that society. That's the idea of being a free man in ancient society. And so if you enjoyed the privilege of being a free man, you were believed to have a responsibility to use that freedom to do good. You were responsible for those who lived in some form of servanthood. You were responsible to help make the community good and to serve the common good, the interests of all people. So you were expected to use your freedom for the sake of virtue, to do good to your neighbor, and so on. And so most virtuous free men devoted themselves to the pursuit of wisdom. So they could be governors, rulers, military leaders, politicians, judges, and so on. They devoted themselves to the study of philosophy so they could use their freedom virtuously and promote and protect the common good of all men. So when we think about philosophy and then we ask, well, how do I pursue wisdom? How do I study philosophy? What should I do? The ancient wise men established a system where they identified 7 arts. And basically that was the curriculum for wisdom. That was the curriculum for the pursuit of wisdom. There were 7 arts that a man had to learn in order to pursue philosophy truly in the right way. And those were called the 7 liberal arts because they were the arts pursued by free men. That's where the word liberal comes from. Liberal means free. They weren't pursued for the sake of money. They weren't pursued by poor people trying to get jobs. They were pursued by free men, usually men who already had money, who were already provided for, who were seeking to learn to be good, to know what was true, and to do what was good. That's what the liberal arts were for. And that's why it's very obvious and reasonable why Christian people all through history were interested in the liberal arts, because they're the arts of truth and goodness. That's what they are. Now, Christianity is a little confusing because we've got religious vocations, and religious vocations are sort of an example of this idea of freedom, where an individual man or woman chooses to devote his whole life to the pursuit of wisdom and goodness, and he's free to do so because the church provides the opportunity to actually live a life dedicated to wisdom and goodness. So it gets a little more complicated in Christian communities because we have this different opportunity in the church. But even in the ancient world, there were men who lived like monks and nuns. Philosophers often lived like monks. They didn't marry. They lived just completely devoted to the pursuit of wisdom. And we can see this all through history. So anyway, that's a quick introduction to these liberal arts, what we're talking about. You should understand what arts are now. They're skills that can be learned by study and practice, and how art relates to work and talent. You should understand that. And then you should understand what the word liberal means. In this context, liberal means the pursuits that are not related to money making or any kind of servile labor kind of work that servants would do, the kind of work that you're not allowed to do on Sunday, for example. Those are works of servile labor. The liberal arts are not such works. They're intellectual works. They're truly human works. They're pursued for the sake of the common good. That's what it means to study the liberal arts. And then when we say classical, it's to distinguish the modern use of the phrase liberal arts, which really doesn't make any sense. We're not just studying, subjects other than math and science. That's not what we mean by the liberal arts. We mean 7 specific arts that are necessary for the pursuit of true philosophy. That's what we mean when we talk about the liberal arts. So we have the 7 liberal arts. There's grammar, reasoning, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Those are the 7 liberal arts. And if you look at those arts and say, well, how are these arts going to help me get a job? They're not studied to get jobs. That's not what they're for. But at the same time, I can tell you that when you go into adult life, it's not even necessary that you get a job, so to speak. As I said, look at religious vocations. If people enter religious vocations, they never need to think about getting a job their entire adult lives. And there are many different forms of life like that. Some people say, if you do what you love, you never have to work a day in your life. I consider my life a life where I don't feel like I have a job. I feel like I get up every day and do the work that I wanted to do when I was 19 years old. and I do it all day, every day. And I get frustrated at night because I know it's bedtime and I have to stop. I want to keep working, and I often lay in bed wondering if I should go to bed or if I should keep working because I love what I do and I'll do it all day, every day. So the idea of getting a job is a pretty dark view of life. And really, if we, as I said before, if we work diligently to gain mastery of important arts, we determine what we do as adults. We become the valuable members of the economy. We don't go around applying for jobs. Other people apply for our services and ask us to work for them and help them and so on. And you don't have to walk around with this idea that, oh, I have to get a job, like I'm some kind of slave to the market. Hopefully, we can be smarter than that and more skilled than that and not be dependent on other people hiring us. So it's a different way of looking at adult life as well. It's the way that a free man would look at life. Okay, there's lots of options, but we only have access to those options if we make ourselves skillful, and that comes by the study of different arts. Okay, so we have 7 liberal arts, not necessarily pursued for the sake of money making or any kind of material benefit. They're pursued for the sake of truth and goodness. That's why we study the liberal arts. And you can feel this tension in your life between the study of the liberal arts on one side and then pursuits of other studies like college prep studies or studies you might think will look good in a job interview, things like that. You'll feel that division and that tension between these two different things. And you've got to be careful to maintain a wise and healthy balance, that you don't allow anxiety about your future to sort of take over your mind and make you a slave to job seeking. There's more to life than money, and that should be reflected in your studies. So we have 7 liberal arts, 7 arts that need to be studied and practiced and cultivated for the pursuit of wisdom. And I listed them: grammar, reasoning, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the 7 classical liberal arts. The first of those arts is grammar, and that's where we're at in this class. We're studying grammar. Now, grammar, again, that word is used in modern schools. Kids go to modern public schools and talk about English grammar and things like that. But there's a big difference between classical grammar, which we're studying in this class, and a modern grammar class. Modern schools, it's hard for many to acknowledge this, but modern schools are really designed for raising common people to make them smart enough to hold a job. That's what schooling is for. We want to teach people to read so they can read instruction manuals. We want to teach people to speak so they can, work as a cashier at the pharmacy and talk to customers, or they can sit for a job interview or something like that. That's the end of modern schooling, is to prepare people for the workplace. It's a pretty dark view of education, to prepare people for the workplace. And so when we come to a subject like grammar, well, we have to ask, what's the goal of the study of grammar? What's the goal in studying language? And for a modern school, or for a school that's badly designed, even if it's a Christian school, or even if it calls itself a classical school, for many, grammar is judged to be necessary for the sake of getting a job or doing something like that. Something that's illiberal, that's not liberal. That's not what the purpose is in the study of grammar. Because if you live in a family where you've got decent parents who work and study to some degree, most Christian families, just by living with people who speak the language, you're going to learn to speak the language pretty well just by imitating the people around you. So, a child grows up in a house and hears his mother and father and his older siblings speaking, and begins to imitate those adults and learns to speak the language well. So you can learn to speak the language well by simply imitating the people around you. And the more intelligent the people are who are around you, the better that you'll speak the language. So you don't need to study grammar to speak the language well, especially your native language. That's why when people criticize, people from the past, and they say, "Oh, well, back in the Middle Ages and in the ancient world, most people didn't even go to school. They were all illiterate, and we were taught to imagine that they were all like dumb people who couldn't communicate, couldn't read, and things like that." That's really not true. You'll be able to communicate by speech, by simply being around people who communicate with speech. So it's really not true that you have to study grammar to learn to speak a language. That's not true. What we study grammar for is to communicate as much of our thoughts and ideas and feelings as possible. That's the goal in studying grammar. The goal is to be able to communicate as much of our thoughts and desires and feelings as we possibly can. Because many of us, especially if we're studying, especially if we're pursuing wisdom, as we grow in experience and things like that, we get very complicated ideas. Ideas become very complicated. The discussions we have become very complicated. So the difference between being right and wrong becomes very, very specific. The errors can be very, very specific. And if our language doesn't allow us to communicate at that level of detail, if we're not able to communicate crystal clear ideas with words that are carefully chosen that exactly express an idea, we're not going to be able to communicate in a helpful way, and we're not going to be able to express ourselves in a helpful way, and that's going to leave us frustrated. It's basically like putting handcuffs on our ability to communicate, and you can imagine how that would be like a form of torment for ourselves to have ideas that we would like to share, important ideas, complex ideas that we just don't have the language skills to be able to communicate. And sometimes, like in the study of reasoning, our thoughts and our words you can't separate them. They're inseparable. And so if our words, if our language skills and vocabulary and understanding of grammar and different forms of words and how ideas are expressed is not developed to a certain level, we actually can't think beyond a certain level because our thoughts are related to our words. So the real goal in the study of grammar is not to be able to speak well enough to get a good SAT score. That's really easy. It's not to speak well enough to be able to perform well at a job interview. That's pretty easy. It's not to be able to communicate to people around us in our lives every day. That's pretty easy. The goal of studying grammar is to continually develop our ability to communicate with words through speech and language at more and more detailed levels so that our thoughts can also develop to higher and higher levels, and we can communicate complicated thoughts, especially in the context where we know things that others don't, and we've got to learn how to communicate them as clearly as possible. That's really the goal of grammar. So if you don't study the art of grammar, you'll be able to communicate with your family and friends. You'll be able to live the Christian life. You'll be able to go get a job. That's all fine. But what you won't be able to do is advance in studies. You won't be able to advance in the pursuit of wisdom. You won't be able to reason beyond a certain level of complexity in thoughts and ideas. And so you'll basically put a ceiling over your head that you can't go beyond. Whereas grammar removes that ceiling or raises that ceiling and allows us to study higher and more complex things. So we can imagine, for example, when Jesus comes from heaven as the Son of God and lives among men, and he needs to communicate these ideas that no one has ever understood before. He needs to communicate ideas about God and the kingdom of heaven and the way of salvation and so on. He's got to communicate these ideas. And what we see in the life of Jesus is the example of a master of this art of grammar. Now, Jesus is different because he possesses this art of grammar within his wisdom. St. Albert the Great taught that the Virgin Mary also possessed a mastery of the liberal arts by the grace that was given to her. But we see in Jesus this ability to take these very complicated ideas, ideas that no one can possibly understand in themselves, and to find ways to communicate them to common people. We see him using parables, for example, right? The kingdom of heaven is like such and such. He gives these comparisons, these analogies. That's an example of the employment of the art of grammar to find ways, find suitable ways to express ideas, to express them in ways that people understand. For those of you in English composition, you know, we talk about this a lot in our English composition lessons. But it relates to grammar because grammar determines how many words you have access to, how many expressions, phrases, how creative you can be with your language, and so on. It's determined by your knowledge of the art of grammar. So really, if you want to pursue higher things, the art of grammar should be attractive to you because it basically sets you free to do that. It's one of the liberal arts. It's an art of freedom. So that's what we pursue in the art of grammar. And in this course, in classical grammar, we're studying grammar of the English language. And again, there are modern English grammar classes, but this one is called classical grammar. Why is it called classical grammar? Even though it's an English course, obviously people didn't speak English in the classical world. Why would it be called classical grammar? The reason why is because this English grammar course was written by a man who was a classical school teacher himself. And he had to teach students Latin and Greek, and he was frustrated at his point in time. He was frustrated because many of the English grammar books weren't designed for students who were going to study Latin and Greek. They were just designed to give sort of a good enough education for kids to teach them the language and prepare them for adult life. But they weren't good enough for classical studies. So he wrote an English grammar book that was intended for students who were going to study classical Latin and Greek. And obviously that describes most of us in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. So in this classical grammar course, what we study is English grammar in a way that helps to prepare us not only to master the English language, but also to study and master the classical languages, Latin and Greek. And that's why it's called classical grammar. Now, when we come to the study of grammar, we have to ask ourselves, how should we go about learning a language? How should we go about learning the English language or Latin or Greek or Spanish or French or Italian or German, whatever language there may be? How should we approach a language to not just become familiar with a language, but to really master a language, to be able to communicate in a language, to be able to understand very clearly other people's communication in a language, especially very intelligent people, because their language will be more complicated than the language of common people. So how should we study a language? And the answer to that is through the study of the art of grammar. And so grammar, wise men who understood language, they determined how a language really works and how it can be studied most efficiently. And if we think about a language, first of all, think about how a little child learns a language. I mentioned before that a toddler in a family just starts hearing words that his mother and father say or that his siblings say, and he just starts repeating words. He starts learning vocabulary and then using vocabulary words as signs of different ideas. And little toddlers, little children will almost talk with the use of words like signs. They won't speak in a sentence. They'll just look at their mother and say, baba, or juice, or eat. They'll just say a word that they know as a sign of an idea or a feeling. And you can see what they're doing. They're just using vocabulary to share ideas. And they can only share so many ideas. And you wouldn't be able to share very many ideas using just vocabulary. It's like in ancient Egypt, they used hieroglyphics to express ideas with pictures. And so they would use pictures and paint pictures on walls to symbolize different ideas. That's fine for a limited number of ideas, but as our ideas get more and more complicated, we can't just keep multiplying images because our ideas can go on getting more complicated forever, and we can't have a system of 50 billion, 50 billion images. So that's why hieroglyphics were eventually abandoned and replaced by other forms of language that were more related to words, spoken words, and sounds themselves, rather than trying to illustrate the idea. But that's how little children communicate. They communicate with words as signs that represent ideas and feelings, and they might just say a word with some emotion, to communicate the idea, like throw themselves on the floor and yell juice, right? They're expressing a complex, or trying to express a complex idea, but they don't have the language to do that. And that's why little kids often throw tantrums. That's also today why many adults throw tantrums, because they have feelings or ideas, and and they just can't express them in language. It's why people use foul language, because they don't have the language skills that they need to express the feelings and ideas that they have. So they resort to these like caveman tactics for communication. So we want to study grammar to be able to communicate as well as possible. So we don't have to throw tantrums. So we don't have to, jump around and yell or use foul language to communicate powerful feelings. We can communicate them clearly with mature language. Okay. So wise men looking at languages and seeing that there are thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of words that would need to be learned if you're going to learn a language like a child by imitation. There's no way we could learn a language by simply learning the vocabulary of wise men. It would be impossible. And as wise men studied languages, they realized that even though that there are thousands and thousands of words, there are really just a few different classes of words. There are just a few different classes of words. And if we study the classes rather than the individual words, if we learn the properties of the classes, then those properties apply to all of the words in those classes. And so rather than study 1,000 words, we can study the properties of one class of words, and we'll understand a great deal about all of the words in that class. And that's the way that wise men study. They study from the top down. They study the properties of classes, and then they work down to species, and then down to individual things. But they start at the top. Whereas common people who are uneducated, they start at the bottom, and they learn by copying and imitation. Whereas wise men learn from the top, reasoning from classes down to individual things. So what they did was they identified 7 or 8 different classes of words, into which all words could be grouped, and then they studied and taught the properties or the attributes of those different classes. And that's the way that we study grammar. So we learn the classes of words in a language. We learn about the classes of words. We learn how different languages express different ideas using these different classes of words. And then from there, we work our way down to the individual words themselves. And so I'm going to share my screen here, really get to this lesson. So in the second part of a second lesson or second chapter of classical grammar, we see this topic introduced, the parts of speech. The parts of speech refer to these classes of words. And so the way that we're going to study grammar, and again, this applies to any language, the first thing we're going to do is learn what the parts of speech are. And then the parts of speech basically create the table of contents for the study of the art of grammar. So we'll almost always start with articles or nouns, and then move on to pronouns and verbs, and then get into the other parts of speech, conjunctions, prepositions, and so on. It's the same process for any language that's studied in this way, studied as an art. So we're going to learn what the parts of speech are, and then from the parts of speech, we're going to then focus on each one of them, learn the properties of that individual class of words, and then study some of the different groups underneath that class, and then we'll understand the words within that class. And then when we come upon a word or there's something that we desire to say, rather than trying to think of where we've heard a word before or how someone else has expressed that we can just copy and imitate, we can actually creatively think of ways to share the ideas that we have clearly so that we can write or we can speak and be satisfied with our communication. We can say, yes, that's exactly what I wanted to communicate. Exactly. That's exactly what I think, exactly what I feel. I've communicated it perfectly. That's the goal of the art of grammar. So in lesson 2, we learn of the parts of speech. Now, when I say that there's a certain number of classes of parts of speech or parts of speech, that doesn't mean that the number is the same for every language. Some languages have words or have classes of words that other languages don't. A very good example is the article. One of the parts of speech is an article. And in a language like Latin, there are no articles. So there are no articles in Latin, but in Greek, there are articles. In English, there are articles. So some languages don't have all of the parts of speech that other languages do, but there's a general set of classes of words that are called the parts of speech, which we can look for in every language. And once we learn the parts of speech, if a missionary is dropped into a foreign land, let's say in the middle of the Amazon jungle, to try and visit with a tribe that no one has ever communicated with, you might wonder, how in the world did the missionaries figure out their languages? Because that's what missionaries often did. They often went to foreign peoples that no one had ever communicated with, that they couldn't communicate with. And within a couple of weeks or months, they could figure out the language of those people. And you have to wonder, how in the world did they do that? Well, they did that by using the art of grammar to go and observe the people, pay attention to how they communicate, and then begin assembling the parts of speech for that language and figuring out how the language worked. And then they could develop rules for the language, and then they could start to communicate ideas using the language of those people. And then they would work to actually take things like the Bible and translate it into their language for them. So it's pretty amazing work. But the way that they did that was because they had first mastered the art of grammar and then could use that art to decipher the languages of other people. And the church did that for hundreds and hundreds of years. One of the groups that was most effective in doing that were the Jesuits back in the 16 and 1700s. That's what they did. They were missionaries. They were very well educated. They studied and taught the classical liberal arts, and they used the knowledge of the arts to go into the world and convert nations, converting them by learning their languages, eventually teaching them the liberal arts, introducing them to Christian theology and philosophy. They often used music as a bridge between the cultures and things like that. But they took this mastery of the liberal arts and used it for the sake of evangelization. So that's a good historical example of how these arts can be used. But we're going to learn in lesson 2 the parts of speech. So let's just take a minute and walk through them. I'd like to ask you to go through this chapter and make a list of the parts of speech and see how many are listed. This may get a little confusing because if you look in different grammar books, you might find different authors of different grammar books give a different number to the parts of speech, because they might say, well, articles and adjectives, they're really kind of the same thing. So we can just put articles inside of adjectives. So we don't need 2 separate classes. So you might see a variation in the number, but they're still included in every grammar book. The authors might just disagree on whether they need to be divided into separate classes or whether they should be kept together. So that's why the number may vary. It's really not that complicated. So let's just walk through this quickly. The parts of speech. In our next lesson, we'll get into this in more detail and go through them individually. But today I wanted to get us started with an introduction to the art of grammar so that we would enter into this study of the parts of speech and have a really clear sense of what we're pursuing here. We're seeking to learn the classes of words that a language uses to communicate its ideas. These are the parts of speech. So we start out here in Article 8. It says the name of every object that has or is conceived by the mind to have an independent existence is called a noun substantive, or merely a substantive. So every object that can be thought of in the mind by itself, every individual idea in the mind, the name for that idea is called a substantive. The word substantive means standing by itself, being able to exist on its own. So if I ask you to think of something like a tree, you can imagine an image of a tree, and that image can stand alone by itself in your mind. We're talking about in your mind, not in the natural world. We're talking about in your mind. The idea of a tree can stand by itself. You can reflect on a tree in your mind, and you can give a name to that specific idea. And if I ask you to think of different ideas, you can do that. If I say, okay, think about an apple tree. Think about an apple tree. You can have an idea in your mind of an apple tree, and it can stand in your mind by itself. And then I can say, okay, now think about a palm tree. And you can shift the image or shift to a different image in your mind. You can have a different image and give that image a name and say, that's a palm tree. Those are examples, those ideas. Remember, we're talking about ideas here. We're talking about ideas. Those ideas that can stand alone by themselves in our minds that we give names to, those names are called substantive nouns. The word noun just means name. The Latin word is nomen, and then we go through French, and that's where we end up getting this word noun from. And we bring that into English for some reason. I wish we didn't, because it would be better to just call it a name, because that's all a noun is. It's a name. So a substantive noun is a certain kind of name. It's a name given to an object that can exist as an idea in the mind by itself. That's a substantive noun, all right? The first part of speech. So when little children, like I was saying before, when they start learning a language, you can see the first thing they start to learn are nouns, substantive nouns. That's the first thing they begin to learn. They just begin to learn vocabulary. They can point at this and say cat, dog, couch, television, computer, tree, sun, moon, and so on. The first thing that we learn as little children are the names of things. We learn substantive nouns. And so you can see again how the missionary going into a community with an unknown language can immediately start to pay attention to the names that they use for things and learn their substantive nouns. That's the first of the parts of speech. Okay? So we see that there in article number 8. And then in the textbook in parentheses here, they give us a list of some substantive nouns. And you'll notice that some of them have uppercase letters like London. We'll learn why in a bit. Some of them are of concrete things like a flower or a man. Some of them are of abstract things like modesty, right? Modesty is an idea that's not concrete. You can't go out and touch modesty in the world, but it's something that can exist as an idea in our mind. So we're going to learn about different kinds of substantive nouns later on. So the first part of speech is a noun substantive or merely a substantive. Okay, first part of speech. Then we go, Article 9 here, such words as can stand immediately before a substantive to denote some property that we perceive in objects is called a noun adjective or merely an adjective. So here's a second kind of noun, a second kind of noun. So it's also a name. And you can see this is an example of what I was talking about when some grammarians will say, this shouldn't be two separate classes. It's really just one class. We're talking about nouns. So there should just be one class called nouns. And then we should divide that class into adjective and substantive. So you can see how one grammarian might say there's one class, another grammarian might say there's two classes. That's why the numbers vary in different grammar textbooks. But we see an adjective noun, a noun adjective. And what we learn about an adjective is it's a name for a thing. It's a name, but the idea that's named in this way can't exist by itself in the mind. Can't exist by itself in the mind. So it's a thing, but it can't exist by itself in the mind. And it's the name for that thing. An example would be a color, like red. Red cannot exist in the mind by itself. We can't just think of red. We've got to think of something that is red. So you might think of a red sheet of paper, or you might think of a red apple or a red car. We can't think of red by itself. We can't think of happy by itself. It's got to be a happy something. And because we have a name for this property, we have a name for it, but it can't exist as an idea by itself. It can't be a substantive noun. It's a different kind of noun. It's an adjective noun. It's set in front of a noun because it has to be joined to a substantive noun in order to be thought of in the mind. That's what makes it an adjective. The word adjective means set next to. It's a name that must be set next to a substantive noun. All right? That's the second part of speech, the second class of words. Then we go on to Article 10, and you'll notice what I mentioned before. In Article 10, we read about a third class of words. We read the peculiar adjective words. So we're told that these are like adjectives. The peculiar adjective words a or an and the are called articles. These peculiar adjective words, they're words that are like adjectives. They're called articles, the words a, an, and the. They're like adjectives because they can't exist by themselves. That's one reason why they're like adjectives. They can't stand in our minds by themselves. But also because they have to be joined to a substantive to have any meaning. They have to be joined to a substantive, and we can replace the articles with other adjectives. One way of in the future, a little hint for you is if you're studying and you have to figure out what part of speech a certain word is, one helpful way to do that is to try replacing it with another word. Okay, so for example, if I had the phrase a prudent man, right, and you don't know what the word prudent means, and you're trying to figure out what the part of speech is, it's often hard to figure out the part of speech when you don't really know what the word means. So you could replace prudent with a word that you do know, like happy. You could say a happy man. Happy could replace the word prudent. And you know that happy is an adjective, so you can reason that prudent is also an adjective. Okay. And with these articles, we can take an article and replace it with an adjective, and the phrase will still make sense. For example, if I say, I saw a man, I saw a man, I can replace the word a with the adjective some. I can say, I saw some man, and that adjective can replace that article. And that's why the article can be called an adjective word or even an adjective, because it really has the effect of an adjective. It can be replaced by an adjective, and the phrase still makes sense. But some grammarians like to separate them into different categories. And we see in our grammar book here, we see that articles are being separated into another category. So the peculiar adjective words a, like a tree, or an apple, or the man, these are called articles, and we study them in Article 10 there. Down to 11, you see the numbers of the articles are on the right side of the page now. Every word by which we express that persons or things do anything, or are anything, or have anything done to them is called a verb. So we're introduced to another part of speech. A word that's used to express a person doing something or being something, expresses existence. or condition or state, or having something done to them, suffering something. That word that's used to express doing or being or receiving, that word is called a verb. And in Latin, this word verb would be verbum, and the word verbum in Latin just means word, which is kind of weird, right? Why would one of the parts of speech be called word, right? That aren't all of these words? Why would one be called a verb? The reason why the verb is called a verb is because in a sentence, the verb is the essential word, the essential part of speech. So you can't have a sentence without a verb. You can just name something, but that's not a sentence. In order to have a sentence, you have to have a verb. And you can have a sentence that is just a verb by itself. It can just be like you could just say sum, and that means I am. That word sum is a sentence by itself. So a verb is the essential word or part of a sentence, and that's why it's given the word word. It's the essential word. Okay. So every word that expresses that a person does something or is something or receives some action, that's called a verb. Pretty simple, but make sure you understand the idea. It's a separate class of words. That's Article 11. Article 12, and we're going to go into these in more detail in our next class. Such words as add to the notion of a property or action. So they add to the notion. The notion is the idea. They add to the idea. They give more detail. They add to the notion of a property or action. They add some circumstance of time or place or manner. These are called adverbs. So we take something simple, a verb like he runs, and we've got this general idea of action. He runs. General. It's general and simple. But we're not satisfied that's really not what we're trying to communicate. We want to communicate something more than that. We want to say that he runs slowly. We want to comment on the manner in which he runs, or he runs yesterday, right? Yesterday he runs. We could try to express this idea of past time. Those words that we add to a verb or to another part of speech to add some more meaning, to add to the notion, to add to the idea some more detail, those words are called adverbs. Now, in some modern grammar books and some English grammar classes, they'll say that adverbs are words that modify verbs, and that's not true. Adverbs can also modify other words like adjectives. So a word that adds to the notion of a property or action, some idea of time, place, or manner, these are called adverbs. They can apply to verbs. They can also apply to adjectives and even some other parts of speech. Okay? Those are adverbs. That's another class of words. Adverbs, and the word adverb just literally means added to a word. An adverb is a word that can be added to another word to add some more detail. So that's Article 12. Article 13, we learn about the pronoun. The word pronoun just means in place of a noun. Pro means in place of. A pronoun is a word that stands for a noun. So if we give the name of a thing, but we intend to continue talking about that thing, we don't need to use the name again and again and again. We don't need to continue naming the idea because we've already named it. We've already given the name for that idea. And the name might be long, right? It might be a name that's difficult to pronounce or annoying to listen to. And we'd like to find a way to refer to that idea, but not continue to use the name again and again and again. And so we can use a pronoun, which is usually a shorter, simpler word that can represent or stand in place of that noun. So those are called pronouns. Article 14, a word that marks the relation of one thing to another is called a preposition. So if we want to talk about two different ideas and express that there's a relation between them, we can use a preposition. And the word preposition means placed before, preposition. Preposition, a word that's placed before another because it shows the relation of that word that follows it to some other word in the sentence, usually nouns. Okay. A word that marks the relation of one thing to another is called preposition. So preposition is another class of words or another part of speech. Article 15, a word that joins ideas or assertions, that is sentences. Sorry, 1 second. A word that joins notions or assertions together is called a conjunction. The word conjunction just means joining together. So if we have two ideas in our mind and we want to join them together, I went to the store and I bought something. What did I buy? I bought apples, bananas, two different ideas. But I don't want to say I bought apples, bananas. I want to show that I bought them together. I bought apples and bananas. So the word and is a conjunction that joins two ideas together and allows me to express a more complex idea. That's a conjunction. Article 16, a word, generally a simple sound used to express some inward feeling, is called an interjection. So a word that really isn't even a word, but it expresses a feeling, is called an interjection. Like, wow, that word, wow, that expression, wow, whoa, hey. Those are called interjections because they're really just expressions of some feeling, some passion. They're an expression. Now, with interjections, an interjection just means thrown in between things. It's like an emotional expression that's thrown in between other words, an interjection. What's important to understand is that, before I mentioned people who use bad language, right? Bad language like curses and foul language and things like that, they're all really just interjections. That's what they are. You'll notice that they're expressed usually when people are emotional. So people won't have a better word to use, and they'll just use this sort of common vulgar word or expression to express a certain feeling or idea. And the more emotional people are, the more they'll curse and use bad language and things like that. Those are interjections. And that's why I said before that, a mark of an uneducated person is often the use of foul language because they have these feelings or these emotions, or they lack self-control with feelings, and they express them, but they don't have words to express them clearly or in a polite way. So they use these vulgar or crude words as the expression of these feelings, which, remember, don't need to be expressed at all if we have self-control. We can keep feelings within ourselves. We don't have to express everything we feel. But often they have feelings and they also lack self-control, so they express those feelings. They don't have ways of articulating those feelings intelligently or politely, so they use foul language. That's, if you wonder, like, why is it bad to say a certain word? It's bad because, first of all, it's a sign of a lack of self-control. That's one of the things that's bad about the use of foul language, is that you've got feelings or emotions and you don't control yourself. You just blurt everything out. Every feeling you get turns into an expression. That's a sign of a lack of self-control. But then, if there are passions that maybe should be shared, they don't have the language to communicate them in an intelligent or polite way. And so they turn to these crude expressions to express those feelings. But they're just interjections. And that's why all foul language can be replaced with proper language. That doesn't mean that you should express every feeling you have. That's why you have reason and self-control to actually decide what should be expressed and what shouldn't be expressed. But the real problem with foul language is that crude or impolite expressions are used to express feelings that could be expressed with polite words or expressions that don't need to use that foul language. So the use of foul language is a sign of a lack of education. It's a sign of a lack of self-control. It's a sign of an inability to express oneself in a respectable way. It's a sign of a lack of education in grammar. All right. So interjections, any word or expression that's used to signify some emotion or passion, like you stub your toe and all of a sudden all of that pain and anger wells up inside of you and you feel a need to blurt something out, that would be an interjection. Okay. That's Article 16. and then we're into exercises and finished with chapter 2. So we've got a list there of parts of speech. I'll avoid scrolling so as not to torment you with that. But what we see in this lesson, these parts of speech, we have classes of words that are used to express different ideas that we have in our minds. And remember, we're talking about using words to express ideas. We're not talking about things outside of our minds. We're talking about ideas and words used to express those ideas. So we talked about the art of grammar. We talked about what the liberal arts are. We talked about how the study of grammar begins with the study of the parts of speech. And then we quickly surveyed the parts of speech for today's class, which I think is a pretty good introduction for the study of grammar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the lesson there for today. We went over chapter 2 in a survey, introductory kind of way. We'll pick up with that same lesson next time, but we'll get into it in a little more detail. And I'll try to dig into these parts of speech with you and help you to really understand them. Because remember, the goal of classical grammar is not just to learn English, but to learn English in a way that prepares us to master the classical languages, Latin and Greek. So we'll get into them, and I'll explain them in a way that will help you more and more. So if you're studying Latin grammar, Greek grammar, you'll really start to progress in those languages by your ability to understand English grammar in a classical way. That's the goal of this course, all right? So what I'm going to do is stop the recording. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Stop this recording.